Verse 54, when Sobhari Muni, who was quite conversant with the self, went to the forest, he performed severe penances. In this way, in the fire, at the time of death, he ultimately engaged himself in the service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So I'm going to go back to 52 and 53. So verse 52, in the beginning, I was alone and engaged in performing the austerities of mystic yoga. But later, because of the association of fish engaged in sex, I desired to marry. Then I became the husband of 50 wives, and in each of them I begot 100 sons, and thus my family increased to 5,000 members. By the influence of the modes of material nature, I became fallen and thought that I would be happy in material life. Thus there is no end to my material desires for enjoyment in this life and the next. Verse 53. In this way he passed his life in household affairs for some time, but then he became detached from material enjoyment. To renounce material association, he accepted the Vanaprastha order and went to the forest. His devoted wives followed him, for they had no shelter other than their husband. Verse 54. When Sobhari Muni, who was quite conversant with the self, went to the forest, he performed severe penances. In this way, in the fire, at the time of death, he ultimately engaged himself in the service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. At the time of death, fire burns the gross body, and if there is no more desire for material enjoyment, the subtle body is also ended, and in this way a pure soul remains. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Tyaktva deham punarjanma naitihi. If one is free from the bondage of both the gross and the subtle material bodies, and remains a pure soul, he returns home back to Godhead, to be engaged in the service of the Lord. Tyaktva deham punarjanma naiti mam iti. He goes back home, back to Godhead. Thus it appears that Sobhari Muni attained that perfect stage. Om Gyan Timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yata Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagna Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagna Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha. He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishapanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpa Turubhyascha Kipa Sindhu Abevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So I have my high-tech notes. So we've got about 25 minutes. So this chapter, the majority of the verses in this chapter have focused on really genealogy. And the genealogy has then, incidentally, Sukadev Goswami has now brought up the example of Sobhari Muni and how he goes through this process of becoming distracted. He then repents and then he corrects his ways. And, this is something that all of us go through as devotees, sometimes on a moment-to-moment basis, usually on a day-to-day basis. We get distracted, kind of think, oh, why did I get distracted? And then correct our ways. But there were three, there's so many ways we can go into this verse, so many angles we can look at it. But there were three things that really stood out for me over the last three verses. And the first point is that, Sobhari Muni became, although he was a great ascetic, he was meditating deep under the water, he became vulnerable. Okay, so one is really, I would like to discuss, how do we become vulnerable to distraction? The second thing I'd like to discuss is also the nature of the mind. When we understand the mind better, it becomes our vehicle. It facilitates us connecting with Krishna. And then the last point that actually Sobhari Muni very nicely exemplifies is actually there's no loss on our path. We carry on exactly where we left off, which is exactly what happened to Sobhari Muni. So when we look at our vulnerability to distraction versus exposure, we not only live in Kalyug, we're living in the Western world in Kalyug. So it doesn't matter whether you're a brahmachari living in the temple or a grahastha living outside. We are exposed to things that we don't always want to be exposed to. Even through basic things like advertising. Even if one chooses never to listen to the radio, never to watch television, just simply by walking down the street, just by other people going about their business, just by posters that are up on the wall. And it's not just posters now. When I was young, it was billboards. So the poster never changed for months. Now it's an LED screen, which literally every 2 seconds there's a new advert on it. And the mind and the senses, they latch onto things. Advertising is built on the fact that our mind and senses are always hungry for something to hook onto. So they feed that. So this exposure is something that, yes, we have control over, but some of it we don't have control over it. And particularly in the Western world, we have less control, perhaps maybe if we were living in the Holy Dham. Although things, unfortunately, in Vrindavan also seem to be, not always as easy as we hope they would be. But the process that we've been given, like Krishna himself, is more powerful than anything in the material world. So when we engage in our process properly, we protect ourselves from that, the distractions, from what we're exposed to. It's like a vaccine, a spiritual vaccine. So we have our different processes. We have, our three main ones, which are hearing, chanting, and remembering. And we have our other 6 limbs and practices of devotional service. We have our ISKCON sandwich. We wake up in the morning, we worship the deity, we chant our rounds, we hear. And then we go about our services and we close the day. The other slice of bread of the ISKCON sandwich is also, again, to hear and to remember Krishna. So our spiritual immune system is strengthened by our practice. But our spiritual immune system is also strengthened by mercy. We predominantly have a tendency to attract the mercy of the Guru and Krishna. But actually, on a day-to-day basis, at least externally, most of us are interacting with other Vaishnavas, other devotees, and sometimes even other non-devotees. And actually this mercy, if we can harness this mercy, it's very, very protective. It really, really nourishes our kripa. So how do we attract the mercy of Vaishnavas? When Bhakti-tirtha Maharaj was still present on the planet, one of the services was that I sometimes got to help out with was typing the emails. And, it's sometimes the best answers are the simplest. People would often write, how do I serve the Vaishnavas? How do I serve the devotees? And the simplest and I think the most profound answer I ever got to type and observe him give someone else was just ask them. Just ask them. That's what happened to Sobhari Muni. What he did was he impeded a simple thing that Garuda wanted. He wanted just some fish to eat. It wasn't a big request. It wasn't, he wasn't asking for gold and riches. He wasn't asking to build a new temple. He wasn't asking anything. He just was trying to eat some fish. And Sobhari Muni got in his way. He impeded his way. And so he committed an offense against a devotee. So often we push away the mercy of devotees just by denying simple things like a glass of water or just kindness in simple interactions or just asking someone, do you need anything? Maybe a warm jumper, maybe a hot glass of milk, maybe just a polite excuse me, I think. move, I want to get to the front. It's Mangalarati time, I want to see the deity. So this actually attracting the mercy of Vaishnavas and generally human beings and people, we respond, we're all generous-hearted. We respond very kindly when someone shows us some kindness. And the good wishes of another person, that's what mercy is. The good wishes of another person are actually relatively easy to attract. And they're very protective. Even the good wishes of a materialistic person can protect us. What to speak of the good wishes of a devotee? Because the good wishes of a devotee will not just protect us materially, but will also protect us spiritually. But we also have the protective factor of Prabhupada's also given us preaching. I mean, the way Prabhupada has woven in the importance of preaching and sharing Krishna consciousness with others into, I guess, our lifestyle it's practically our sadhana. It's practically our day-to-day sustenance to preach. It protects us. It's like armor. When we serve others with the attitude of, how can I assist you? How can I serve you? How can I lay myself down so you can walk over me to reach Krishna? This is very pleasing to Krishna. This is very pleasing to Guru Srila Prabhupada. And this is also very, very protective. Now, preaching isn't just about, we've heard so many times, it's not just about sitting on the Vyasasana giving class. It's not just about going out there doing amazing big preaching projects. But everything we do, whether you're the cook in the temple, whether you're washing the pots, even when you're at home, as grahastas, I think we often forget when you're inside your four walls that nobody else sees what's going on inside the house. Actually, it doesn't take a lot for any of us to come to an assumption, even if it's not the right one, about what's going on in someone's heart, mind, household. So setting an example, even if somebody's not actually watching, is a really, really important part of being an ambassador for Krishna, being an ambassador for Guru, and being an ambassador for this process. However, our strengthening our spiritual immune system is extremely important. It still leaves us with the exposure aspect. And, the exposure aspect, like I was saying earlier, when we have a strong spiritual immune system, it doesn't matter what we're exposed to, it's like water off a duck's back. You look at a duck, anybody ever watched the ducks in the lake? They never get wet. I just have to dip my trainer in and it's soaked. But they swim around, nothing. You don't even see a bead of water on them. They've got this amazing film on their feathers which really protects them. So us keeping our spiritual immune system strong gives us that film. However, even if we've said, okay, right, I'm not going to expose myself to anything other than that which may inadvertently happen. I'm going to keep my spiritual immune system very strong, and one is even steady in keeping their spiritual immune system strong, has a good strong morning program, has very nice attentive rounds, is reading and hearing regularly, is associating nicely. We still have the effects on our mind from earlier in this life, perhaps before we took to Krishna consciousness, earlier in this life before perhaps one might have achieved some steadiness, and also previous lifetimes. And these sit in the base layer of the mind, what one calls a subconscious. And Prabhupada describes the mind very nicely. He says the mind can appear to be still, just like still water. And you don't know that there's activity there in that water until a little bubble comes up and pops at the surface. And sometimes we're caught unawares. We're sitting peacefully, life's going along fine. We think, wow, finally I found a place in my Krishna consciousness and in material life where everything's feel balanced. And then something pops up, a desire, a thought, a memory, and one can become distracted. Okay? Again, one can become distracted. Now, the advice that's given to us is actually we tolerate. Better to just tolerate that and continue with our process, because if you feed it, just like Sobhari Muni did, he fed it and he said he's been left with unlimited material desires now, material attachments. And so in the end, he just said, all right, I'm putting that all in the rubbish bin and I'll move on and carry on where I left off. Which, if you look at if we look at how the reaction to offences work, when we make an offence, yes, we don't necessarily go backwards, but if we consider our journey from being not very Krishna conscious to becoming Krishna conscious, in that journey, when we make an offence, we fall in a ditch. And when you fall in a ditch, our progress is temporarily stopped, And so when you climb out, you're carrying on where you left off, which is what Sobhari Muni did. I mean, just to give some context to how troublesome the mind can be, and how much, even for basic sanity, people need to be taking shelter of some form of God consciousness. You look at the statistics. I mean, I work as a psychiatrist in a locked rehabilitation unit for ladies who have schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, self-harmers. And the statistics show that actually the biggest burden globally on the planet, and so this isn't just Western world, but globally, but disease burden is from mental health problems. So that's bigger than heart disease, bigger than cancer. Okay, so we've now reached a point where actually the body doesn't give people as much trouble, doesn't inflict as much fear and concern, as much as the mind. And the second biggest reason, the second most common cause of young people that's under 18s in this country leaving the bodies is suicide. It's because they choose to. And above that, it's road traffic accidents. So, it's the mind's really, without God consciousness, without a process that steadies the mind, controls the mind, and brings the mind back to its original state, which is like Shishi Radha Gokul Nanda Ki Jai, Sitaram Lakshman Hanuman Ki Jai. It's very hard to even enjoy what one has, the technological advances, the lack of poverty in the Western world. And, we are constantly under attack. This is reflected in those figures. But most of those illnesses are preventable. Yes, there are some cases where a person can't help. It's just part of their karma, their makeup, their genetics, that they're going to develop something. But most cases, it's preventable. And most cases, it's very much caused by, or a strong contributing factor is over-identifying with the body and the mind as the self. Because misery is relative. For one person, not knowing where their next meal's coming from is the peak of their misery. For another person, and I'm giving a real example here, they become suicidal because their bedroom's not big enough. Some people don't have a roof over their head, and I've had patients who've come threatening suicide because the council are not going to give them a 3-bedroom house instead of a 2-bedroom house when there's only 2 people living in the house. So this isn't somebody who's got 10 children and they only have 2. This is somebody who has adequate space. But you know what? There are nice developments in the field of mental health, in people understanding that actually we need something more. Spirituality and mental health is a big topic. It's now normal to go into a mental health unit and talk about how you want your spiritual culture to be part of your treatment, how you would like to pray, how you would like to chant, how you would like your spiritual community to be involved as part of your care. And there has been a substantial amount of research looking at the virtues of God consciousness and how that helps recovery, looking at the practices in God consciousness. Now, I'm being very conscious about saying God consciousness rather than spirituality, because the studies that have studied people who just practice generic spirituality actually show that they're perhaps more vulnerable to mental health problems. And the understanding is because there's no community to support and there's no, Shastra, nothing, no core principles really to take support of. Whereas when we, take shelter of a God-conscious process, we not only have community around us, but there are answers to our questions. So the current thinking, even by scientists, is, if you're going to be spiritual, be God-conscious spiritual and be part of a community and not just kind of sitting there making up your own version of events. Even having practices like mantra meditation are becoming acceptable as a treatment. So in our hospital, we have Kripamoy Prabhu's daughter, Janvi. She comes every couple of weeks and does mantra therapy with the patients, so kirtan therapy with the patients. And it's amazing because, our service users, our patients, they some of them are so disturbed they can't even bring themselves to chant the kirtan, but we do it in a place which is the communal area. So even when people are walking through, they get to hear. The unit's very small, so even the offices, the staff in the offices, they can hear everything. And I remember the very first time Janvi came. It's Janvi and Ananda come. And the office is right next to where she sings and leads the kirtan, and they do about 45 minutes. They do a variety of different mantras. And the first note she sang, every single member of staff in the office just turned and looked at me, and they just went, oh my God, our hairs are standing on end, and we feel so relaxed because it's a really intense atmosphere to work. And they just stopped everything they were doing, and they just listened, and they said, we should have this for us too. So, it's so, sometimes we get almost numb to that. We take for granted the effects of the Mahamantra. But these people, they haven't, I'm not just talking about the patients, the staff, they're not used to hearing such a peaceful, such a beautiful, such a transcendental sound on a regular basis. And they really felt it from the first note. And they didn't then look for papers to prove that the Hare Krishna mantra is a wonderful mantra for healing and relaxing. They were sold just on their own experience, just a few seconds, that's all it took. So we don't, I don't think we always realize how fortunate we are, because we're not always subjected to the same things that people outside of Krishna consciousness are. I'm not saying we don't have mental illness. Devotees never get into mental illness. Devotees do, and sometimes we're disadvantaged by the fact that there's pressure on us to never get mental illness, because it means that you're not a pure devotee, or you're not a devotee if your mind gives you trouble. But the fact of the matter is that mind by nature gives us trouble. That's just how it is. And sometimes, unfortunately, it gives us trouble through illness. It could be depression. It could be schizophrenia. But the advantage we have is that as well as medication, as well as occupational therapy and nurses and social workers that we should have access to and should take advantage of, we have a process which cleans and steadies the mind on a much, much, much deeper level. Okay, medication doesn't clean your mind of desires. An occupational therapist will not do that. We know all of these things, neither will the psychotherapy. So in fact, sometimes these things set those bubbles opening and popping open from the surface of, underneath the surface of the water in the subconscious that we weren't even aware of. Sometimes they can make things traumatic. I'm not trying to put you off if you're getting help, not at all. I'm just saying, we're very fortunate to have a process like chanting. It should never be given up, and the association of Vaishnav should never be given up either, because other people's consciousness can actually help us to steady the mind. But understanding that, that the mind is so impressionable, we can actually use that to our advantage. So just like the mind can be filled with rubbish, it can also be filled with Krishna consciousness, or Krishna. And we know this, we understand this. It's one of the first things that we're taught when we come to Krishna consciousness. Actually, Krishna consciousness, we were doing a university talk yesterday, Krishna consciousness is very easy. You don't have to change so much about what you do externally. You just change the reason you do it. You bring Krishna in the center. But how many times does our chanting become mechanical? How many times does our hearing become mechanical? How many times does our remembering become mechanical? It has less potency, less effect when it becomes mechanical. And the more we progress, the more Krishna expects from us. Not that he expects us to do more, but he expects us to invest more in our service attitude. When he's asking Arjun to fight, he's not really so interested in Arjun fighting. He's not so interested in Duryodhana and his brothers and the Kauravas being destroyed. He can do that like this. What he's interested in, he says to Arjun, you fight, but you focus and you put your energy and your effort in your service attitude to me, in your love for me, because ultimately that is what connects us. And, today's Gopashtami, we're so blessed. I think out of all the different cultures, we have the most festivals. And then I think after that, probably Jewish people have the most festivals, because they also have a lot of festivals. And we have this entire month. Just this 1 month, we have so many festivals. And then the next one comes, and then the next one. I mean, I think pretty much every month we have a couple of festivals. Is there any 1 month where we have nothing? So we're very fortunate. We have festivals where we can really use the purpose of that festival to harness, the mercy that comes with that particular festival, the mercy of the Vaishnavas, and also use those pastimes to remember. So our process is all about, exposure. When we expose ourselves to the names of Krishna, when we expose ourselves to his form, when we expose ourselves to his qualities, when we expose ourselves to his associates, these then start to replace. It's like CBT, transcendental CBT. These start to replace the impressions we have in our mind from previous lives, from the billboards, from people walking around in the street, from television, from adverts, from desires we had before we took to Krishna consciousness, and they start to get replaced. Now, one thing I've been reading a little bit more closely recently is Nectar of Devotion, and particularly looking at remembering. And, in the beginning, Prabhupada explains that there's 3 different types of remembering. He says there's 3 ways of remembering Krishna. One of the ways we remember Krishna is by following his instructions. The second way we remember Krishna is by seeing everything through the eyes of Krishna's words. So this Gyan Chakshus, so seeing the world, seeing activity, seeing life through the eyes of Shastra, seeing through Krishna's instructions. So these 2 methods of remembering Krishna seem to be indirectly remembering Krishna. And then there's direct remembrance of Krishna by remembering his transcendental activities and pastimes. Now, what Prabhupada explains in the Nectar of Devotion is that the indirect methods are essential because they get us to a point where the direct remembering goes from being just recollection, okay, because at the moment, or for some of us, many of us at the moment, our remembering of Krishna is mostly through, at least the direct remembering is through hearing. We hear his pastimes, and if we happen to remember, it's we're doing some contemplative, what's known as contemplative recollection. So we are being purposeful about remembering a particular pastime. Sometimes that little bubble that comes up to the surface happens to be not something traumatic, not something that we desire, which goes against Krishna consciousness, but actually happens to be, we're in the middle of doing something completely unrelated to Krishna, and actually get this wonderful thought of Krishna, or wonderful thought of his devotees, or some pastime that Krishna is engaged in. Or we remember the softness of Krishna's black curly hair, or the blueness of his skin, or the softness of his butter-like soft butter feet, and or the cuteness of his cheeks. There might be so many things that they just pop into the mind, or the beauty of his garland, or you might remember how the deities looked so beautiful this morning. So we want, our process is so effective that actually very quickly one can transform the disturbance of the mind to actually something very beautiful. That even when we're not recollecting in a contemplative way, that we're becoming so Krishna conscious that the bubbles that are popping are droplets of nectar, bubbles of nectar. And then we transition from that to then actually our mind is filled more with thoughts of Krishna than of anything else. I was listening to a class by Mother Urmila, and I've had some discussions with her about this, that, how does the mind go from this kind of almost, we can only really remember Krishna for a very small moment, and mostly our mind's full of garbage, to then actually having very steady remembrance of Krishna. And she describes it like tuning a television. So if you're younger than me, you might not have come across these televisions, but hopefully most of you have had some experience. We used to, now most TVs are automatically tuned, but before you had a thing on like a turning knob on the television, and you turn it, and the picture's very, very, very fuzzy to start off with. And then as you turn it, you get like a glimpse of color, and you think, oh, I think I'm in the right direction. And then you turn it a little bit more, and slowly, that picture starts to become clearer and steadier. Okay, until you find, aha, I got it, and the picture just stays. So I thought this was a very nice way of describing that, how the mind transforms from this not being our very good friend, being almost like our greatest enemy, to then becoming our very good friend and giving us spiritual television all of the time. But these 2 processes, the indirect processes of following Krishna's instructions and seeing the world through his eyes, through the eyes of his instructions, are essential, because you can only tune the television to what you want if you know what you're looking for. So we can't concoct and make up Krishna's pastimes. It won't work. Knowledge and remembrance, forgetfulness, all comes from Krishna. He will block it. If we try and think of something bogus, he will block it. Okay, this protects us. It protects us from becoming sahajas. It protects us from doing something before we're ready. But if we study and hear properly, then actually this idea of steady remembrance, of being able to then, what one could call visualize or conceive what the Lord allows us to mercifully remember, it becomes very easy because we know what we're looking for. So the reason it's very important that we go through the stages. All of our stages have a purpose. It's not that one is better than the other. And I'm watching the clock, and I have about a minute left. So I'll start to wrap up. Maybe I need to... I'll leave some things maybe for another time. But, I just really wanted to sum up with that we should... if we should be... this term that flies around, being Krishna confident. We should have confidence in our process. If our process isn't, even if we're doing everything right, if it feels like we're not making progress, have patience. It takes time. Sometimes the cleaning takes time. There's that example of sweeping a room, right? When the room's dusty and nobody's ever cleaned it, you just see you can't really, the air looks clean because the dust is all settled. You start to sweep it with your jharu and suddenly, oh my God, what's all this stuff? The room looks more dirty than it was previously. And it makes you want to go, I'm putting down my jharu, I'm leaving, this room's too dirty to clean. But slowly you continue, and you're not letting in any more dirt, you're completely clean yourself, but it takes time to clear out that dirt. So we should be Krishna confident, and also those nectars, those little bubbles of nectar that do pop up, give them more attention rather than the little bubbles of distress. And just bringing it back to relationships. Those 3 points I mentioned at the start, reflecting on Subhari Muni's experience of Vaishnava Aparad, and then the unsteadiness of the mind, how that pulled him away, and then again carrying on where he left off. These things are facilitated, all of them, by our relationship with devotees. Our relationships with devotees are crucial in protecting us in our spiritual life, in advancing our spiritual life, in keeping our minds steady, and also helping us to carry on where we left off. Because one thing that's very evident, and again, this is something that I saw when Bhakti Maharaj was leaving. So we were with him for 5 months, right up until he left. And one of the most profound things I saw were there were devotees writing to him who hadn't stepped into... They were saying, I haven't stepped into a temple for 15 years. Okay? This has encouraged me, your experience has encouraged me to come back. But they came back and they were welcomed with open arms. We are so lucky that we can come back to... We can go to any temple on the planet, anywhere. And we have the language of Hare Krishna, Prasadam, and Mahaprasadam. Even if they only know those 3 words, we're sorted. We can enter any temple anywhere. You see anyone wearing neck beads, and we have a connection. We can carry on where we left off, where we don't have to feel rejected, and we won't be rejected. And we will do what those around us do. We will carry on where we left off, whether that's happening to us every hour, every day, if we're rejoining the movement every week, it doesn't matter. Those relationships are so important.